Hello, friends, and welcome to the Friday Conversation, episode 116. Hope you're having a great week. This week I talked to author J.V. Hilliard. We discuss a variety of topics as usual, including fantasy, publishing, getting a publisher, querying, board games, Dungeons and Dragons, a bunch of other stuff. Had a really great time. Hope to talk to JV again soon. If you'd like to hear more of me, you can find me on Page Chewing Comics and Manga, Film Chewing, or Speculative Speculations, and all those links can be found down below in the description. Hope you're having a great week and hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks again for listening. Hello, friends, and happy Friday. Welcome to the Friday Conversation. This week I am here with JV Hilliard. JV, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, I know sometimes it's tough to line for the planets to align and for all this stuff to work, and so I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Yeah, we were just talking about having an assistant and having help, and I don't know. I think having an assistant they wouldn't want to deal with me for very long. So it might not.
I don't know what I'd do without mine. I am almost wholly dependent upon them at this point. So I'm just glad that they're willing to put up with my BS sometimes too.
Yeah, it's I don't know if I want to put someone through that on my side. Maybe one of these days. But anyway, so tell us about your work.
Yeah, so I am an epic fantasy and dark fantasy author. And so if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or Dungeons and Dragons, that's the genre in which I write. My novels, I have 3 novels out currently with a 4th on its way, and it'll be the final in a 4-book series called the Warminster Saga. Books 1 and 2 are Amazon bestsellers. The 3rd one and the 4th one, hopefully, knock on wood, will also be bestsellers when the 4th one comes out here in July. So I'm looking forward to completing the series. And the series itself, I've licensed the intellectual property from to create an augmented reality and virtual reality video game that will be released in 2026. And then I'm also working on a deal right now to convert my novels into graphic novels. So if you're a comic book nerd like me, you'll enjoy reading them a lot more quickly than you would unless you enjoy reading epic fantasy like I do. And if you do, you'll prefer the big, thick books versus the comic books. But, I'm left side, right side brain, and so I like them both.
Yeah, as you can tell from the shelves behind me, I'm kind of a fan.
Yep.
Yeah. So speaking of which comic books have inspired you or kind of stick out in your mind or have kind of given you direction on your own work?
Well, from a comic book perspective, I enjoyed the first version. I think what really got me into comics was the release of the Dark Knight Batman series back in the 90s. And in part, I think that's when comics started to take a bit of a turn, and they went from goody-goody, good guys always win, to sort of dark comics. And that's when, Robin, you find out that the original Robin had been killed, and then the second Robin, gets killed in those books. And, and I've always liked that. And that's why I think I've taken the tack that I've taken for my fantasy writing. Like epic fantasy, you always have these great struggles and the good guys always win. And then Game of Thrones hits you in the face and the good guys don't always win, and it's more realistic. And so I've taken that tack too, where you've got this epic realm with unique magic systems and unique currencies and unique pantheon of gods and all the kind of things it takes to build an epic fantasy realm. But sometimes the bad guys are in charge, right? And sometimes the bad guys win. So I like taking, I think the Dark Knight stuff really kind of inspired that, spun it out of me. And of course, it's gotten more and more popular throughout the last 20 or so years, I think some of the more dark and graphic novels have really embraced that. And I think that fandom, especially those like me who read the goody guys win all the time when we were younger, and then when you get older, you realize realistically that doesn't always happen. And then you see the adaptation of that, and you're like, okay, well, this is more of an adult graphic novel. And I get it, and therefore, it's okay. I'm not going to be upset that I might have been when I was 10. Those things don't. And now I just appreciate the story for being a better story.
Yeah, I grew up on Chris Claremont's X-Men, and I think that's one of the all-time great runs. But I struggle with getting into more of like epic fantasy and classical fantasy that the good guys will win. And because there's very little in doubt, and I get the comfort in that. I think it's more of a comfort food that you know that good will prevail and things will be okay. But much like you, I like the having things up in the air, and you never know who will be standing at the end.
Yeah, and I think it makes for better novels. And when first of all, I had a chance to meet Chris at several Galaxy Cons in which I spoke. You know, and the X Men run parallel for me, right? I really enjoy those, and they also too, took a turn for sort of like a dark sci-fi, dark fantasy, especially with with Wolverine, and then ultimately, even the funnier stuff, the comic relief you have in Deadpool,
Yeah,
and things like that too. And is he an X-Man? Is he not an X-Man? Like that kind of stuff, and kind of the fun you can have with that. But you're right. I mean, I find that nothing against the classical fantasy stuff.
right.
I look at Conan the Barbarian, Sword and Sorcery. Conan wins, but there is a lot of jeopardy in that, right? You
Mhm.
feel that when people die around him, his friends, his family. You find that in the struggle that he has to overcome physically, mentally, and emotionally, to escape Thulsa Doom, or escape any of the Conan adventures that are part of that. And that kind of stuff has really always been attractive to me.
Mhm.
And even the Lord of the Rings stuff, there are bad things that happen to good people in those novels. And I think that Tolkien did his best to take some of his real life experiences in World War One, and in that time frame, and bake them into these novels, while also showing that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And you're right. I mean, there's something comfort foodie about that. There's something happy about that in the end, to know that that Frodo is gonna win, or Bilbo is going to win. But there's a lot of bad things that happen in the interim, which allow you to suspend that disbelief. So it's not always the good guys winning everything they do as they go out. So, I get it, and
Mhm.
that's one of the reasons I put this sort of dark and, in some cases, gothic spin into my novels.
Yeah, even I think even with Lord of the Rings, it's the end is bittersweet though, right? It's still not. They all went back home and things were fine. It's still kind of a mess. So there is a like a dark twist to even like Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, and I would describe it as realistic,
Yeah.
right? Like there's the scars of battle for the winners still out in some way, and whether that's like in a PTSD way in
Mhm.
some instances, or it's a way where they're wearing their scars. In Frodo's case, he sails off, with the reincarnated Gandalf, and and that's it's a little different ending than I think most people would like to remember. But I think those realistic twists make it more believable. And in a world that's in a fantastical novel or set of novels, you have to be able to suspend that disbelief. So there's got to be some form of realism in there, and sorrow is a great form of realism. Struggle is a great form of realism. And understanding that not everybody's going to come out unscathed also makes it more real for the reader.
Yeah, definitely. What are some themes that you explore in your darker works? Are there certain you mentioned PTSD? I think that's something that I see more and more in more modern fantasy. That I think it's really fascinating to explore in that kind of context. What are some themes that you explore in your work?
Yeah, so themes and tropes, make the world go round when you're an author, right? So I think I would use the term struggle
Hmm.
as one of those themes, and struggle can mean much. It can mean anything. It can be struggle physically, struggle mentally, financially, health. All those kind of things. In my novels, there's a struggle towards redemption. There's a redemption arc for the villain, and does he take the redemption arc that Darth Vader takes? Yeah, or does he not? And that's the question. When why does he yes or no? Or there's unrequited love, or in some cases forbidden love,
Hmm.
a love that the um, two of the protagonists have to make a decision to overcome cultural differences, to allow them to be together. And do they not do that, or do they choose to do that? And what are the implications of that, for them? And you find that out as the novels in the series go on, and they're not always clean. And there are there for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and that happens too. But I also like the idea from, again, you asked for certain, themes. I like the hero's journey,
Mm.
something where you see the Harry Potter, the Luke Skywalker, the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey, find their way through, and they stumble. That makes them human. It makes it more believable.
Mm.
And so for me, as I write, I always look for those places where you want the characters, the main characters in particular, to make mistakes, because we all make mistakes in our lives, and it's how do you recover from that? And in some cases, can you?
Mm.
And what are those kind of places for redemption and recovery? And PTSD was one of those things I did explore, and in part it's because my family has a broad and deep military background, and one of the characters, whom I would describe as not a main character, but main enough that you follow her through it, has a situation where she does have a PSD moment.
Mm.
And it's something, especially at the end of book 3 and into book 4, really plays itself out. I mean, there are things that she has to overcome, and her love interest in the novels helps her, at least tries to help her overcome those things. But I think that makes it real, because these people, you can't go from battle to battle and not experience some of this stuff. And others, it affects differently. There's like the Jon Snow effect, where he's
Mm.
just doing it for duty and love of country and doing the right thing all the time, or Aragorn in the same way. It's like, I'm going to carry this burden with me, but I'm not going to complain about it because I know that I was built to do this. And then there are others. And in my case, one of the characters, she's a merchant, right? And she
Mm.
was not meant to do some of this stuff, but has this misanthropic adventure that puts her in deep, and she ends up having to do stuff she's not used to doing, and traveling with an army and seeing death up front. And then there's a collapse where she is in a cave, and she frees herself from that. But anytime she hears certain sounds or things that, it calls it back to her. And I think that makes the characters much more real.
Mm.
And so those are some of the things that I've built in terms of themes, of tropes, and of course, specifically your PTSD example.
Yeah, I think it's like you mentioned. I think it makes the characters more relatable and more interesting, I think, in some ways, because nobody can go through those types of experiences and not have some kind of damage done to them psychologically or physically, and it has to that you can't be in these huge epic battles and not take something away from that. I mean, I think you're seeing more and more of that being explored, and it's really fascinating to
Yeah, I
see
think
the
as a
those effects.
society, as we get to know more about that too, and
Mm-hmm.
how it's treatable, and how you get it, and an understanding of it.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a George Carlin skit once where he started talking about words, and he says, the over a period of time, words get watered down to protect you from what those words originally meant. And he used shell shock. He said in World War I, it was called shell shock. In World War II, they called it battle fatigue. And
Mm.
by the Vietnam War, it was called post-traumatic stress disorder. And it takes away what it will. But he said they would be treated better if they still called it shell shock.
Mm.
And you could extrapolate that into many of these things that we carry around with us, because you don't want to say what it actually is, because you might offend somebody, or you may end up saying something that at one point was okay to say, and now it's anachronistic, or it's not current, and you can't say it, but it's really at the heart of the matter, right? And he used it in his comedy, but it's in the truth of it all. PTSD and traumatic brain injury and all the kind of stuff that
Mm.
comes from that, is those are real injuries, and whether they suffered a physical injury on a battlefield, oftentimes it's a mental aspect of it that catches up to them, and with higher suicide rates and drug and alcohol stuff and things. And those are all real. And to bake them into an epic fantasy novel, I think does inject that form of realism. And it makes you really kind of confront those things and make people think about it, because you don't see it when, you watch the Lord of the Rings movies, or, Star Trek, or Star Wars. They just go from next battle to the next battle until they win, and that's, like you said, that's all great, and there is some comfort food there, but at the end of the day, that's not real. And I think that's why I categorize my stuff as epic and dark fantasy.
Mm. Do you do a lot of mixing between the two, or when you start a series, do you kind of decide on a tone and go with that tone, or do you start with something more classical and epic and start exploring kind of the darker themes?
Yeah, well, I look at it from a world building perspective, and I think the first step in my planning of any series is always going to be the world. So you create this world, and there are aspects of it that you as the writer need to know intrinsically, but that you can leave nuggets along the way to explain certain actions and aspects of the realm as part of your world building to your readership, right? And so the readers, when they get it, they don't have to know on day one the pantheon of gods that might exist, or they might not need to know right away that, I'm referring to a gold piece, or like I know Star Trek, Star Wars, I always use credits. Like,
Yeah.
what's a credit? Like, what does that mean? But if I say it's a golden laurel or a silver, palmette, or a copper sheaf, it adds something to it. It brings a level of gritty realism to it,
Mhm.
and you just drop those hints, and it puts you into that world, and then you figure it out as you go along. You don't pick it all up on day one. So I think that's how I started, sort of globally at a 30,000 foot level, and build the rules of the realm, and then what's the geopolitical, assumptions of the realm, and then how, are there races in those realms, and how do they interact with one another? And is there are no inherent goods and inherent evils in any situation, so you try to make, at least as I write it, try to make everybody on equal footing. And there are realisms that they have to deal with, social and political mores that pop up that they have to face as part of that. And that's part of the challenges and the themes that we talked about a little earlier. And then that's when I inject the dark stuff. You figure out how, you want the protagonist to succeed, but they don't always all make it there.
Yeah.
Right. And it's sometimes in their death, they advance the final outcome, which is good. There's some level of self-sacrifice and duty that comes as part of that, and that's also thematic as we discuss those things. But also, as you look at it, more, as you get more granular to it, I think that's when you can inject those places where bad things happen to good people, and it makes sense because then I can understand what happened there. And I'll give you one perfect example of it. My favorite character that my readers have by far are not my protagonists. They're an assassin. And the assassin is the world's biggest jerk. Like, no one, I mean, he's an assassin, right? But everybody loves him. And I've got more people coming up to me saying, don't kill him. He's your Boba Fett. I love that character. I love the way he acts. But, they never ask the question of how he got to where he was. They just accept him for the fictitious character he is. So I wrote a standalone novel, which will come out later this year, which is his origin story, so that you can understand he wasn't born inherently evil. You found out what brought him to where he is, and which fork in the road he took and why he took it. And it has to be believable. It has to be something that you might have chosen too. And when you put yourself through his shoes, you walk a mile in his moccasins and you see through his eyes, you're now like, oh, I get this. Like, I get why in Canis Druwaith became the Black Rose. I get why, he's this assassin. I now know why he's bent on this revenge. And it makes sense to me, but I think that, going back and writing that origin tale made a lot of sense because he was so popular. And I want to see what people think, because in that origin story, he's not who you think he is.
Yeah.
And if something happens and he gets punched in the face, and he takes a turn that is, very similar to many villains. And that way it's not an inherent evil that's born like an antichrist. It's more like, hey, this is, something that was developed, and he was created. And, does he choose to come back in some way, or is he just lost? Right. And that's the character decisions you have to make, the character arcs decisions the author has to make as part of that. And I think that's what's exciting about it. So yeah, I think epic up here in its first, and then the dark stuff fills in the fun parts and makes the story more realistic.
Yeah, I think all those villains, like you mentioned, your character that we wrote the standalone for. I think all those we accept the character for who they are when we meet them, but going back and seeing their origin, I think is always has some type of tragedy involved. And I think that's some kind of really you can feel the grief and tragedy behind who they become when we first meet them.
Yeah. And I think the same thing holds true for any good story, right? They can't, how boring would it be if nothing bad ever happened to the main characters, right? It just, it wouldn't be much of a story. You would be bored with it by chapter 2, so this kind of challenge that's set forth, do they overcome that challenge, is important, I think, to setting down the path of not just the character arcs, but also the plot arcs and how they intersect down the road.
Yeah, one thing that always it's a little sad, it's a little bittersweet for me as a reader, because the more that I've learned about fantasy and world building, you start to realize that there was this big iceberg that we the readers see above the water, but there's a ton of work and time and material, I guess, that go into what's below the water, below the surface, that we really don't see, but it affects what we do read. We just don't really realize it. It's kind of sad that we don't get the whole picture. I mean, I know why we don't, but there's a lot of work that goes into building these worlds and these characters that we're often don't get to see.
Yeah, I'll answer that in two ways. The first is absolutely. That's why I like epic fantasy, because in a lot of cases, you get to go back and read the past. You get to go and look and see that these characters have a future, and you learn about the realms, and it's all encompassing. And that's fun for me. I like that. And that's what makes it so epic. It's just not a standalone tale that could happen anywhere. It has to happen in this world. And this is the world that, I'm going to tell you about. And, let me tell you the days of high adventure, bam, and it's in your face, and you learn it as you go. And in many instances, you learn the rules of the road as you go. But for us authors, it's just not us. I mean, the invisibility part of this is it goes through a development editor, a copy line editor, a second editor, my publisher, and a handful of beta readers. It's really a team sport, right? When it gets down to it, by the time this thing goes to publication and is available publicly, it's gone through anywhere between 10 and 15 people that have agreed and helped the story be perfected, and that's the beauty of it all. Like if I just printed the novel I wrote without anybody else seeing it, it would not be as good as it is by kind of running the gauntlet. You know what I mean? There's a baptism in fire that happens where people say, well, what's wrong with this is wrong, or I don't get this, or this character doesn't make sense to me, or I wouldn't have done that. And all these things that come back to you as an author, look, it sucks. I hate it's the worst part about it. Editing is the worst part about being an author, but I liken it to like going to the dentist. It's like, I know I don't want to go to the dentist. It's going to suck. It's going to be uncomfortable, but my teeth are going to be clean. I'm going to get a clean bill of health, and I will, they will be as clean as they are for the next 6 months. And that's what you get. You get a clean, healthy product that you can put out for people to buy and consume in the hopes that it's a good enough story that they buy the next, right? Or download the next, and I think that's, for me, people don't see that part of the iceberg. You're right. They don't see the work that goes into it, the team sport it is. And that's why when you see authors' acknowledgments, and there's like 2 or 3 pages of them, and they're talking about, oh, my wife, my girlfriend, my cousin, sister's uncle, my blah, blah, blah. Like everybody there, it's because that's how many people it took to get that book into your hands.
Yeah, I never realized before I learned more about the craft and what goes into writing a book. And you don't really realize all the time and work that goes into it, and how many, like you said, how many people it passes through and how many people have input. That's one thing I think I would struggle with at first, at least, is getting all the input after, because it's kind of I would imagine it feels like your baby, and then people get to pick it apart. And was that hard for you at first?
Well, it was when I didn't know it was going to happen, and then once you see the final product, you're glad it did. It's kind of like a boot camp, right? In the sense where, hey, I'm not going to go in perfect, but I've got what it takes to make it. So let's go in there and get trained up and figure it out. And you just have to develop a thick skin. And I think a lot of authors have a tendency to be introverted, and they don't like people criticizing their work, but it just makes it stronger. And iron sharpens iron, right? And so if I have another author or set of authors or creatives look at it and say, I don't get something, and they're being honest with me, it's not being detrimental. They're just saying there's a flaw here, and I might be nose blind to it. I'm too close to it. I wrote it, and it's in my head, so it might not be on the paper. And they might have to read it and say, it's not on the paper. And I'll say, well, where isn't it? And they show you, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's right. It's not on the paper. So you have to go in there and put it in there. And I think that helps your product become better. I'm not saying I look forward to the editing process, because it takes about just as long to write the manuscript as it does to go through the final editing process. It's literally the same amount of time most of the time, because it goes through people, and then you get their stuff back and you make changes. You send it back for them to reread, and then they send it back to you with more changes, and you send it back to them to reread. And by the time it's all said and done, you're like, my goodness, how can there be any errors in this? And there always are. Like I tell people that all the time. And it's hard to explain, but the truth of it is, it doesn't matter how many eyeballs see it before it goes out, there will be an error in it or something that you down the road regret. And you're like, oh, I wish I can go back and change that. But, just let it go. And you become a better author by opening yourself to that constructive criticism. I'm not talking about the trolls that give you a 1-star and never tell you what was wrong with it. But when the one thing I'll say that the first time I encountered what you just said, so it was my first 2-star review on Amazon. And the woman who left it for me said, I bought this book for its cover. I wanted to love it. I got 50 pages in and I couldn't do it. 2-star, did not finish. And for about 10 seconds, I was enraged. Like, how do you stop reading a book after 50? And all of a sudden it was like, bing, this light went off in the back of my head. And I said, wait a minute. The nugget I can take from this is she liked the cover. The cover sold the book. So my illustrator did the right job, right? And so from there, you're like, oh, I get this now. And you're able to kind of take that back and, and take the bitter with the better.
Yeah, I'm curious. You bring up reviews. I go back and forth on that because I think some authors claim they don't check reviews. I don't know if I believe all of them. I guess some of them don't. But
we're all liars. We all check reviews. You kidding me?
Yes.
Kidding me?
But I know some authors who just will not engage with the reviewer at all because I know there's a school of thought that reviews are for readers and there should be a barrier between the two. But I also know authors who, if they get a bad review, they ask for, okay, like, why didn't that work for you? Or what about this story beat didn't you enjoy? And they want kind of a back and forth. Where do you draw the line, or where do you stand on that kind of debate?
Yeah, I invite it. I think, and maybe that's because I've been an entrepreneur for the majority of my life. And what I say that is sometimes you get turned down by somebody. I get told no a lot, right? Just because by the nature of what we do. And what I've learned over the years is no is the second best answer, because usually someone that's courageous enough to tell you no, instead of just stringing you along and saying it's the best thing I've ever read, you learn more from the no's, right? You learn more from people that said this is what I didn't like, and that helps you make your novels better the next time around. And so for someone like me, who started writing during COVID, I had to learn on the fly. These were things I didn't know that I was doing right or wrong or should do better. And so the second book and the third book and the fourth book are all better for it. And if you're open-minded to it, it's fine. You don't have to engage your reviewers directly either. You can lift wisdom from what they've said, as long as what they've said is honest. And if you're honest with yourself, you're able to go back and apply that to make sure that you don't make that same mistake the next time around. And I think those kind of things help you, not just as an author, but anywhere. It can help you when you're making your widget or doing your show. Hey, I didn't like this. I didn't like that. This is what you ask those questions because you want that kind of feedback. And for me, as long as you have a thick enough skin that you're not going to go cower and pout and not write the next book, use it for what it is. I mean, really go out there and try to make it, take that review, or take those comments when you run into people at book signings or conventions, where they're like, oh, I really didn't like the way that this ended, or why did you do it that way? Take those things to heart, but you don't always have to agree with them. You can always say, well, this is because the story's better this way, or whatever it is. But you at least learn what people are thinking, and that's good to see through someone else's eyes.
Yeah, it is. It's all these weird rules that kind of become gospel to some. I think it's interesting how everyone has their own kind of viewpoint on reviews and readers and interactions. But yeah, I think it's a great attitude to have, to be open to that. You mentioned you started writing during COVID. I think a lot of people, because of, we couldn't go anywhere or do anything. It sounds like a perfect time. Why did you make that decision to begin writing and take it and to pursue to get published?
Yeah, well, it was always something on the bucket list to do, always something I knew, even from when I was younger, that I was going to write a novel one day. And if you would have asked me prior to COVID what it would have been, I would have thought some sort of vampire novel. But, for me, I'm a lifelong Dungeons and Dragons player. I know the genre really well. I had a great idea for a story that became a series. And, from that perspective, I used that downtime where many of us weren't doing anything or couldn't do anything to really learn the craft and do it. And what I found out was this is the backside of my career. This is something I want to do every day as opposed to just doing it, from time to time. I really want this to be what I do. And in order to do that, I've got to sell books. I've got to make enough money to do that because, in my businesses, I make a heck of a lot more money than I do as an author. And so there are ways that, once you start to sell more, and there are ways that you can start to, like I did, licensing the intellectual property into a couple of different directions. Now there are different mediums through which your art is being published, and you can then make money on those as well. And so if you're a hustler, I just applied my entrepreneurial background to it. And I was like, look, I am the brand and my books are the product, and I'm going to get those books out into as many hands as possible. And so I hit libraries and I hit, book signings, and I do, literacy, literary festivals, and I'll go to conventions, and I don't care how small or how big the audience is, I'll try to get myself in front of them. I mean, even doing shows like this help me because I reach an audience of folks that watch you, listen to you, that might not have known that I was out here. And if they like what they're hearing about what I'm writing, or like me personally, they might give it a shot. And that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah. I want to find out, I want to hear more about selling your IP and what that entails. But before I started doing this stuff, I didn't realize how brutal the publishing business can be. I mean, I don't know if you don't know the ins and outs of it, or kind of like what goes on behind the scenes, or what it takes to get published. Because you just go to a bookstore and there's books, or you go to Amazon and there's millions of books. What surprised you most about your journey to publish your work?
It was exactly that, right? So I think that the publishing realm is anachronistic. It's 100 years out of date. And in part, Amazon blew it up. They were the disruption that created a marketplace for independent authors or hybrid publishing companies to step in and help, where before, the experience you have as an author who's trying to be traditionally published is most of the tracks begin with you getting an agent, and that takes time. And then most of those agents then have to pitch you and your work to a publishing house that matches you. And that also takes time. And the way that these, old protocols are in place, oftentimes you have to wait 3 months. You give someone your book and they don't want you socializing it anymore, because just in case they tell you that they're going to publish it. And in other cases, they never get back to you, or you don't get feedback from anybody, right? Because they don't have to. And that's the way it used to be. But Amazon cleared that up, and that's why 82% of books sold these days are bought on Amazon, because first of all, it's available ubiquitously. Second of all, you could go on there and publish your book tomorrow, and you don't have to go through a publisher to do it. And if you're just trying to get a piece of art out there and you want to do it, and you don't care any books you want to sell, that's a great venue to which to do it. But it also makes the market as big as an ocean. 80,000 new books a month are put into Amazon. Sorry, so you're having 1 million new books a year. How do you, as an unknown independent author, find your way through that? You're just a sea of flotsam and jetsam, and you're a needle in a stack of needles. It's like there's just too much out there, right? So you literally, the traditional route, which is very intriguing to folks, what you find out is you lose a lot of control. 80 to 90% of your royalties are going to your publisher. In my case, it's 50-50 because I'm with a smaller traditional publishing house as opposed to, one of the big five. But, ultimately the advance they give you to write the book is nothing more than a salesman's draw. Like, that's not money for you. They're giving you money to live on, banking on the fact that you're going to, before you see penny one in royalties, pay that advance back. Hence the name advance. It's like, hey, it's like, I know that you've got to go out and sell those cars, and it's going to take 30 days for you to sell a couple of cars so you can make your commission. So I'm going to give you a salary, but you're going to give me that back before I give you your first commission. That way you'll have time, you'll be able to feed your family during that time. And so at authors that are getting a $10,000 or $25,000 commission to write stuff, that's just an advance on future book sales. And you have to do that based on zero up until you've sold it back. And then after that, you still owe them 80 to 90% of those royalties. So imagine how many books you have to sell to make money. And that's the truth of it all. Now, the independent side sounds a little bit more exciting because of that, right? You're eliminating that possibility, but then no one knows they don't know who you are. And going with a publishing house allows you access to their email lists. In some cases, it will allow you access to their publicists. And believe me, a publisher is different than a publicist. A publicist gets you gigs. A publisher gets your books on bookshelves. Two different things, and people sometimes conflate the two. And so because of what Amazon has done and other book outlets have done, have allowed people to put stuff out there. And in some cases, it's not always the best, right? There's a reason they didn't get published. In other cases, it just takes years. I had a friend of mine, true story, the woman who edited my first book and told me it was publishable, literally had published another book. Her publisher had passed away. And before she got her second book out, she had to move her stuff to someone else. 141 queries she had to make before the 142nd accepted her book. And that was someone who was already published and successful as an author. And it's just, they're in their way. They're in their own way. And no one explains it to you. So you get frustrated and people quit. They'll send out 20, inquiry letters. 2 people will respond and tell them no. And then they don't even hear from the other 18 and they get discouraged and they'll continue, or they go indie and do it that way. And there's goods and bads with each side of it. I'm just suggesting that it's an industry that really needs to be overhauled from either direction. And it's one that I wish I had. If I could snap my fingers and be king for a day, I would overhaul that industry in a heartbeat.
So 80 to 90% of royalties down just for the publisher.
Yeah, depending on the kind of publisher that you have, right? So if you have a traditional publishing house, typically it's 80%. Some of the larger ones will take 90% because they know they're going to sell you millions of copies of books. They're also taking a risk with you to do that. So, for them, they're going to get you the right awards. They're going to get you in front of the right audiences. They're going to get you in front of people that they know. And so you just don't step out into the world and get that done. You have to be somebody to get in front of those publishing houses, right? So you could be an ex-president or someone who's running for office, or you could be someone that has some level of celebrity attached to them. And as a result of that celebrity, it allows you to sell books, right? So like right now, I wouldn't even approach Penguin, even though I've had a relatively successful run, because I don't have 500,000 followers, right? That's what they're looking for. They don't want to take a loss on anything. So they want to know, well, you got 500,000 followers. All right, we'll publish you. And that way, we'll take that minuscule. Same thing in the film industry these days. Yeah. They just they don't read scripts anymore. It's like, all right, does this book have a follower? Did it sell 10 million copies? Okay, well then we'll think about adopting that as our story, and let's go in and take a swing at it. It's never going to be the indie author just wrote a book, and that's a 1 in a million, right? And still at that point, you have to gain momentum. It takes years to get there. I mean, that's why we see popular series like Dragonlance and Ravenloft and, the Dark Elf trilogy. No one's made a movie about them. Mm-hmm. And they have millions of followers and millions of book sales. It's still not, in the realm of, green lighted for, some of those movie makers and stuff. Like, it's crazy how it works, but it would be different if I had some sort of celebrity attached to me where it's like, all right, well, I'm going to sell books just based on your name. And you'll see a lot of nonfiction stuff done that way because it was a sexy story. It's the trial of the century, or, it was the political move of the year, or whatever it might be. You can get away with that. But for the most part, you've got to have a name like that, or else you have to work your way up to do that. And that's exactly what I'm doing now, is working my way up to maybe a level of acknowledgement where someone like that might accept or make an offer and say, hey, why don't you come over to my bigger firm?
Wow. You mentioned the publishing industry being outdated. It kind of reminds me of the music industry in the late 90s, before everything kind of went digital and blew up. It seems like they're stuck in their old habits, and I don't know if they're afraid or it seems to work for them, but it seems like we're on the verge of a major shift. I'm just not sure which way it'll go.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I mean, the Napster stuff and the other things that happened, and once it became mainstream, that's exactly what Amazon did for the indie author, right? They provided them a conduit through which they could do it. The difference here is, no one's stealing music. There's no plagiarism going on here on our side. But you're right, and its part is because the industry just refuses to change, even in the wake of Amazon and or audiobooks and or ebooks. It still has struggled to change. It just doesn't embrace that kind of change. You still have to find an agent, or you still have to find a publishing house that'll be willing to accept it. And there's no guarantee. So you can sit on the sideline and as long as you want, and no one cares, until someone makes you an offer, right? And do you have the patience to do that? And if so, then you might find that Sherpa that can guide you through, to the top of the mountain and make it work. Some people have that patience, other people don't. And you could have a great product and still not be published. I mean, there's a lot of indie authors out there that we see that are just as popular. And there's an effort, there's a movement out there to help indie authors. Indies help other indies because of that, right? They'll buy each other's books, they'll talk to each other on shows and things like that too, because they want to promote each other, and there's a camaraderie that exists there that doesn't exist, at the traditional publishing houses, which are zero-sum game most times.
Yeah, it's there is that shift happening. I know a lot of indie authors, and one of our friends we have a forum that we got a little community, but one of our friends, Alex, wrote a novel, and he's been querying it for, I don't know, 6 months to a year, and he's sent out, like you said, I don't know, like 50 to 100 queries, and he's still hammering away at it. But it's just that must be really rough to get either no response, or at that point, I think I'd be happy with a no thank you rather than nothing, I guess.
Yeah, and there's no sense of obligation. And I get it. It's because they're inundated. Like if I were sitting on their side of the table, they have someone called a slush editor. And a slush editor before it gets to a real person, it's going through their slush pile, and someone's looking at it and saying, oh, this is a good story. I'll pass this on to my boss so that they can make a serious professional evaluation of it, versus other things. And then other times, it's chosen thematically. Over the last 10 years, we've seen that done a couple of times. I mean, good product is left on the sideline because it doesn't fit what's popular in the day. So sometimes you just run dry. Like the vampire thing was very sexy for a while. We had Anne Rice, we had Twilight, and it was like, and we have to put it on the shelf for a while. And then the dystopian stuff with Hunger Games and all this, and then you got to put it on the shelf for a while, and people are tired of the dystopian stuff. And you have to catch the right wave and ride that in. Or in other cases, it's an outreach, a specific outreach to the gay community. It might be specific outreach to African American community, where they're opening the doors to some that might not have had doors open to them before, but then it also precludes other people's good stories. And you just might not be at the right place at the right time for that, regardless of how good your story is. Sometimes they're just accepting they want to do something because it's the current wave of doing things, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's just you're choosing to kind of make your own path, and that's what publishing houses, they can do that. They don't have to follow anybody else's rules. So like there are times when you see a lot of that stuff too, that affects your ability to get published. And my advice to your friend is keep your nose to the grindstone, keep count. It's a funny thing to keep count of how many times you didn't hear back or didn't. And I use that for motivation. I saw one of my favorite football players of all time is Hines Ward. He played for the Steelers, and Hines Ward would always use, nose as motivation. Well, you don't have an ACL, you can't play receiver, or, you were only a 3rd round draft pick, or you're not going to make the Hall of Fame because of blah, blah. And he would just use that to fuel himself. And for me, when someone tells me I can't do it, then I go ahead and try to do it, and I would tell your friend, I would advise him or her to do the same thing.
Yeah. We're cheering him on, but hopefully
there you go. There you go.
Yeah. But back to the IP and you selling your IP, what are some things that you were careful about to retain control over when you sold your IP, about how, because I would imagine you want to be careful with how your stories are told or how they're handled or managed. What are some things that you were sure to kind of cover before passing it on?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And it's one I don't get often. But the truth is no matter what I do, the stories are going to change because they're taking a different form. Right. So you're playing a video game, and it's a point of view video game, and you as a character, your own avatar can choose to do a variety of things. You don't have to follow the theme of the story and the plot line of the story. And you could be a bad guy. You don't have to be a good guy and all that kind of stuff, which, video games will give you that ability to do. So even though what I wanted to do was set the rubric around which the story was told. So there was some level of truth in it. But at the end of the day, those characters that are learning my story by playing it as opposed to reading it, those players become readers. And if they want to find out how it really went down in the book is a river, right? It has a current and it takes you through the entire thing. And sometimes it gets rough and other times it's calm, but it tells you a good story. But this is, when you're playing a video game, it's your, make your own adventure kind of thing, right? Especially these days where you don't have to follow, we went from level 1 to level 2 on Mario, right? You don't have to do that anymore, right? And so this gives you a lot of things, to change. And then when you get to graphic novels, what I found out about that was I have about 160,000 words in my books. I have about 25 words on a page in a graphic novel. And they've got to take 2 chapters and put them on 8 panels that fit on 2 pages as it opens up and show me illustratively what I showed you in 2 chapters. They're showing you in 2 pages, and it's showing you the story through and so of course stuff is going to be missed. So the best thing that you can do, and getting back to your original question, what I did was I made sure that I was baked into the storyboarding process of everything, knowing that, look, I'm an author. I'm not a video game designer. I'm an author. I'm not a graphic novel designer. They know their medium better than I do. And I realize that there are going to be things that are just going to drop or have to change. And as long as I'm comfortable with that, I'm okay. As long as they're comfortable with me saying, here are the guardrails, stay within the guardrails. Everything else you do, this is how the story really progresses. This is what people like about it. You can't just make up a story and an end. And an example I give to people all the time that ask me that question is, one of my favorite series to read were Lee Child's Jack Reacher series, right? There's like 20 books in there. Well, Jack Reacher to me is, 6'8", 6'10", 300-pound muscle bound guy. And then they cast Tom Cruise as Jack Reacher and he's 5'6". Like it didn't make sense to me. My brain was like, that's not Jack. But Tom Cruise did a good job. His movies were fine. You know what I mean? And he played the Jack Reacher character to heart. You just had to get used to seeing him through the eyes of the people that casted him in that. And for me, that was hard to do in the beginning because I had read all the books, right? And the same thing would happen here. Like if you said that my main character looked completely different than he did in the books, that would be a little bit of an adjustment I would have to make to the video game or whatever it might be. So, for me, yes, the answer is it was important, but I also learned to stay out of the way and just create the guardrails through, and as long as they're working within that within the guardrails, stay on the road, then we're fine.
There must be a little, I don't know, I think it'd be a little nerve-wracking, right? To have someone else handle, I guess, after it's been through the other 15 to 20 people to publish the book, and then to go from that to someone else's hands to convert it to a different medium. That's a lot. It's good. It
is a lot. And that's why I think being part of the storyboard process, so they can sit there and say, what is this? Or what did you mean here? Or we don't get this. Or do we have license to do that? We have some creative license to make something new here. And as long as I'm there for it, it's not culture shock. It's not like you walked in and you're like, wait a minute, where did this come from? I didn't approve this, or I didn't understand where this wasn't in the novels, right? You're part of the ride for that. And so those things aren't going to upset the apple cart because you've already discussed them and you either accepted them or you've rejected them. And sometimes you do. Like they were doing a promotion. The video game company was doing a promotion for me about a year ago for early adopters. And what they wanted to do was have sort of a scavenger hunt through which you would gain in-game currency that you could use to improve your avatar. So when the game comes out, you're already ahead of everybody else because you've done training or you've gotten gold pieces. And you're able to use that experience you gain through doing these things. And they were asking me for, we need a smithy. Do you have a blacksmith in your book? And they created their own Twitter X account for this fictitious character, and people had to go find them to then, get the right answers so that they can push and things like that. It's great because now you're learning about the sidebar characters. You haven't even read the books yet. You're just here because you're a gamer. You're not a reader, but now you're learning because you have to. And those kind of like tricky things really made it a fun process. And I was being able to be part of it, allowed me to understand how they were going to do it and how the stuff was going to come together.
What went through your mind when you start to see the graphic novel and or the video game kind of come together, to see it on screen or to see it on a page illustrated? What went through your mind when you saw that?
Oh, it was anxiety plus excitement all at the same time, right? Like, when I saw the characters, on the graphic novel side, it was like a police sketch artist, right? Like, I'm there telling you what the character looks like. And then you've got someone who's really good on the other side who took great notes and listened, who created a character, and they turn that piece of paper around and you're like, yes, that's the character. And you're surprised how well they do that. Like, I don't have the talent for that. I guess like maybe mine's reversed. If they gave me a picture of someone, I can write a story about that person, and things like that if I ask the right questions too. But, that kind of stuff was a lot of fun. And at the beginning, you're like nervous because you don't know how good or how poor it's going to be done. And, and then, at that point, you're like, all right, well, let's just get it over, pull the Band-Aid off. And you find out that, it's really better than you thought it was going to be. And they're professionals too. And they know how to do things within their medium that make it better for them. Right. So I think that's, for me, I had to accept that. And then once I got over that, the anxiety kind of melted away, and you realize that you're going to see your work of art in a new form. And that's just as exciting.
For your IP, do the publisher have to okay that too, or do you own your IP and your publisher doesn't have?
I own it. There are parts of it, if it was related to the book, or if it was related to foreign sales or things that she owns rights to, then I would have to get those approved. But in my conversations in the beginning, when I did it, it was obvious to me that I was going to have like universal yes or no on it, and she almost wanted it that way, right? I think she thought that it was the best way to handle it, and I was glad that she was in agreement with me, and and that way it made sense, and it made it a lot easier, and that way there wasn't certain approvals. Now, if they wanted to change outcomes or wanted to change the storyline and things like that, she might also be more engaged, but right now that hasn't been a problem in either of the ventures.
That's good. So for someone who's querying or who's pitching themselves, or who's trying to get a publisher, trying to get a deal, or trying to get their book published, what are some things that you would warn people to look out for? What are some red flags, I guess, for people who are
right? Yeah. Process? So there's a number. Make sure that you're not approaching like a vanity press. And sometimes there are folks out there that will publish your stuff and just take payment for it. If you're paying them to publish your stuff, you might want to take a second look at them. And sometimes there are hybrid publishers out there that are really good at that kind of thing. And part of what they're asking you to do is have skin in the game with them. And that's a business decision you've got to make, and that's totally fine. There are others out there that will publish books that shouldn't be published and just do things, and there are reputations and stuff. You should watch out for that as an author. I think that would be step one. Make sure that your publishing house, you talk to the other authors that are in the portfolio, that you've vetted them to see that they're publishing the kind of books that align with what you're doing, so they're putting you on the same shelves as their other authors, and to make sure that they're living up to their end of the bargain, because in the end they're taking a good portion of your royalties for doing that. And if you're going to make money at it, you got to make sure that you're with somebody that you trust that's going to have you back. And so that's important. Number one. Important number two is make sure that I hate to say it this way, but make sure you really want to be published in that regard. There are ways that you don't, like the indie route is so much easier these days, and you make it your own, right? So if you own every success and you own every failure, if you're an indie author, and you might not have the backup or the backstop of a professional, more traditionally published house that's there to help you understand what the marketplace is bearing. So you might be out there on your own for a little bit, but there are groups that you can join that help you through that. They'll help you coach out there. There are publishing coaches that are out there that'll help you do those things too. But it's not everything it's cracked up to be. I think in the past there was a stigma for those that could not get published, that over the last 10 or 15 years, in particular in the US, maybe not as internationally, but in the US, the indie author is just as well received these days as the traditionally published. And you just have to, like for me, as a businessman, I didn't enter the realm without knowing. There's that old saying, if you don't know the horse, don't make the bet. Well, I didn't know the traditional marketplace for book selling. So I wanted someone that was my Sherpa. That was the term I used earlier. I wanted someone that could guide me through this. And for that, I was willing to give them a piece of the pie. And it's worked out really well for me. That's not always the case. So make sure that if you find that partner who's willing to take you through that and you find the right publishing house for you, then just make sure you vet them, talk to their other authors, find out what their successes were, find out where they failed. And if they're true and up, they're going to give you those contacts anyway. Or you can look them up and connect with them through any forms of social media and sometimes on their websites and just ask them what their experience was because you're thinking of going down that way. And they should tell you. And that's the one piece of advice I would give.
And earlier you mentioned tabletop games and role-playing games. How much has that influenced your storytelling or the
ridiculously amounts? I mean, for me, so as a player, whether you're, tabletop or any kind of RPG, you get a chance to battle test your story, right? Whether it's a character that you're playing as a player character or whether it's a dungeon master or a game master who's running a campaign with a bunch of other experienced players, by virtue of what they like and what they don't like and how the battles went and how the stories went. And so you get to game test it. You really do. And so what I've been able to do is take 20 years of gameplay and weave it all together into a story because I know it's already worked. And you can tell sometimes as a dungeon master when you're talking to your group of players and they're all staring at you and they're seeing through you. They're seeing what you're describing. And I think as a good storyteller, you take that verbal story and turn it into a written story. And if you're able to translate it in that way, then you've already gotten these battle tested stories that are the best, and you throw out the bad ones. Oh, that didn't work real well, so I'm not going to use that in my story, but I'm going to use it. And you can change the names of the characters. You can keep the names of the characters. You can do a variety of things, and they stay with you. Like those adventures. I remember my wife teases me all the time because, I'll get together at Christmas with my D&D nerd friends, and we'll talk about adventures of stuff that never really happened in real life. And they're like, "What are you guys doing?" And I'm like, "Well, some guys get together and they play poker. We get together and nerd out and play Dungeons and Dragons. And so what's the difference? I'm not smoking a cigar, drinking a beer. Instead of sitting here just having fun with my friends, so it's just a different way. But that's why I think it's influenced me because those scenes, those memorable things that you talk about after they've happened really are the things that need to go into your novel. At least in my case, that's what I've baked into mine. And it's worked for me so far.
Yes. I've always wanted to try playing. We have a group on our forum that get together and do an online game. I just haven't joined them, but it sounds daunting for a new player. It sounds like a lot, so I'm a little nervous.
Look, it's a game. Yeah. That's what it comes down to. It could be very technical at certain points, but if you've got the right group, they'll nurse you along. They'll make sure that you're not left behind. And, that way they're not taking advantage of you or your character or anything like that. I'm serious. Like I've been in some groups, bad groups where they're just there to cause chaos for everybody else. And you don't want to play with those people. You want to find groups that are there that really want to play together, good group of friends, solve the mission and work together as a team. And those are the fun ones, right? So if you find that right group, they'll bring you along. You'll get that experience. And once you play 2 or 3 times, you'll get it. You'll know what dice to roll. You'll know what happens next. And it's just basically telling a story and then asking you what do you do? Right. That's exactly what and it's as simple as that. So don't be afraid of it. You'll pick it up faster than you think you will.
Yeah. I just wonder if I need more hobbies is another thing. I don't know I think I have too many already, but yeah, it's a lot of stuff, but it is a little wild to know how many fantasy stories have started or were inspired by, or like you said, directly taken from like the Dungeons and Dragons campaign.
Yeah. I think just because other authors have experienced the same thing. Hey, this was a really good story. We played it out. I know how it ends. I know what I can change for the bad things that were in here. We're going to make it the best story it is. And people will gravitate to it because they're like, oh yeah, that works. They see it. That hero's journey that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. It's wild. The time absolutely flew by. I didn't realize what time it was. But I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask all of my guests before I stop bothering you. But the first one being, do you have any favorite family recipes?
Yeah. So my mother used to make a spaghetti sauce that was just ridiculously good. Like every one of my hockey friends, after you spent 3 hours on the ice and you come home in the winter and it's like a piping hot spaghetti with my mom's meat sauce. She made this stuff and it was a simple Prego, a simple ragu sauce, like off the shelf stuff. But she would, the ground meat, and she would mix it with veal, and just the soft. It was so good with diced peppers, and green peppers, and onions, with just enough garlic powder and garlic salt. And oh man, dipping garlic bread in that and pounding away. Whew, that is clearly my favorite, and it's simple. It's nothing like just literally big bowl, roll the balls, throw them in, chop up the vegetables, throw them in, the right mix of spices and a little bit of tomato paste, and bam, you've got this thick Sunday sauce, as we call it around here, where it's just, you want to talk about comfort food? That is my comfort food.
Nice. I'm going to have to find that recipe. Just you talking about it made me hungry.
Oh, I'm starving now, man.
Yeah.
You killed me with that one.
I know. I'm like, whoa, I'd like craving spaghetti now. So another question I had for you is, if the zombie apocalypse started today, what would be your weapon of choice?
Oh, katana, man. Chopping off heads, that would be a lot of fun. Now, it's easy to say, I want, a minigun, or I'd love to have something that's, a repeating rifle, but just imagine wading through those with a katana, like a samurai, would be just so much fun. And I know that's kind of stolen from Walking Dead, and we've seen it in a couple of other shows, but that to me, I would love that. I think that that plays to my D&D ish kind of thing, with sword and sorcery versus modern day weaponry. Yeah, I can go in there with Puff the Magic Dragon and just mow them down, but I'd rather not. That makes it boring.
Yeah.
Let me go in and wade in and just chop off some zombie heads.
So speaking of The Walking Dead, did you read the books and or watch the show?
I read the graphic novels before I watched the show. So, like, I was ahead of. I mean, of course, that's a perfect example of what we talked about earlier, where the graphic novels differ from what actually happened in the show. But I obviously I like the graphic novels better, but I really enjoyed The Walking Dead. And then there was a point where it kind of like jumped the shark. The Negan stuff, it jumped the shark for me. There was like too much Negan, and I know he's a popular character. And at that point, I kind of stopped watching. And Fear of the Walking Dead was not as good. It was just too much, right? It was saturated. I think it happened. So I kind of walked away from there at the end and didn't finish it up.
Yeah, it's the was it issue 100 when Negan showed up? I remember reading that and just it was something, but it just didn't have the same impact on the show. It just wasn't this. It just didn't have the. It was just, I don't know.
No, they did a couple, like the governor and Negan and some other, like there were some good characters. The Daryl character is a perfect example of that, though. Like there is no Daryl character, and it's like, but Daryl's one of the more popular characters in the show, right? So like, you get that, and you just take it for what it's worth, and it was a cool character that they made for him, and hey, nothing wrong with that.
No, not at all. Yeah, it's interesting adaptation. But another question I have for you is, what was your first job, and what did you learn from that experience?
My first job was cutting lawns. My dad put me to work when I was 10. Literally, and I had to cut my neighbor's yards. So by the time I was 13, I had about a dozen yards that I would cut on a weekly basis, and I learned the value of work and saving. And for me, it was my first entrepreneurial endeavor. It was for me to, I learned, and I didn't create a business out of it as much as it was just me as a high schooler cutting, people's lawns. But it was enough there that you put in some time, and you do it at night and do it during times where, and you're responsible for it. And then you realize how much more money you can make in a short period of time than, people that were doing, I have to spend all night at the I don't know, whatever store at the mall. Right. And you're like, ugh, that had to suck for you. And, you're out in the sun, you're having a good time. It's a lot of fun. And you make I made enough money at that I didn't have to work on the winter. You know what I mean? I didn't have to do that. So I still did it, but I didn't have to if I didn't want to. But that part was a lot of fun. So that was my first job. And, for someone that has allergies, it wasn't the best job to have, but I learned a lot of life lessons from it.
allergies or something, aren't they? Jeez.
Especially this time of year, man. It kicks me in the butt.
Yeah, it's not a fun time to suffer from allergies for sure. So another question I like to ask everyone is, if the roles were reversed and you were in my position, was there a question that you would have asked that I did not ask?
That's a great question. The problem is in the beginning, I told you there were no rules here,
Yeah.
and I said, you can ask me anything you want. And I think you did. So I'm not sure there's anything you necessarily missed. You know, I honestly don't know. Maybe the question of, the 30-second elevator pitch on the novels itself. I mean, I mentioned Hero's Journey before, but it's really about I would say the trope that exists is the, chosen one versus the false prophet, like that kind of stuff. You get this, kind of good versus kind of evil as part of the story. And young Damus Alaric has visions of this fallen keeper coming back to take revenge on his sect. And he's the only one that sees him coming. And that's hence the story, The Last Keeper, the name of the first novel. But there's so much more that goes into that. I hate those elevator pitches, but it gives people a sense of what the books are going to be about. So if you like those kind of like epic tales, those epic struggles of, the world's going to fall into darkness if the good guys don't save it, the Warminster Saga is the series for you.
Yes. And you mentioned the standalone. When do you expect that to be ready or to be published?
So we'll have the standalones out later this fall, right before the holidays. We'll have the first standalone out for In Canis Drew Waith called The Black Rose. The second and third will come out next year, and that will buy me enough time to write the next series. So the next series, the follow-on series to the Warminster Saga, will come out in 2026. 2025 is going to have these smaller origin stories that are a little bit more manageable to write, and that'll buy me some time to work on the rest behind that. So, get a little bit of a respite in there.
Nice. That must be exhausting to have to keep the momentum going for a big series like that.
Yeah. I mean, the Beatles once famously said, you could take forever to release your first song, but then after that, you've got to be on schedule. Bam, 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 bam.
Yeesh, it's a lot. With another thing we were talking about on our forum about the second book and getting your second book out and what all that goes into it, just kind of keep the readership engaged, not go too long.
That's exactly right.
It's a lot. It's a lot. But anyway, so if someone wants to connect with you, where's the best place to find you?
I'm easy to find. So joe@jvhilliard.com is the email address. I always try to get back to everybody, within 24 hours. You can go to jvhilliard.com and check out the works. Or if you're looking to buy a book, download a book, listen to a book, you can find me pretty much on every platform. Dragon Moon Press is my publishing house, and that's where I would prefer you go to buy it. But if you're an Amazon shopper, you can find it there. If you're an Audible listener, you can download it there or on iTunes or wherever. And it's available in hardback, paperback, audio, and of course digital.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Is there a big difference between buying it from the publisher and buying it on Amazon?
Yeah. So, my publishing house, I don't have to. So if I sell a book on my publishing house's website, it's a 50-50 split. If I sell it on Amazon, Amazon takes their piece and then I get my piece 50-50 split. So I make more money if you buy it directly from my publisher.
Makes sense. And plus it's good to support publishers too.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially the small ones like mine.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much. I had like I said, the time just flew by. I didn't realize what time it was, but thanks again.
Well, I enjoyed it, man. I'd be more than happy to do this again. You're a great interviewer, and I appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk to your folks.
Oh, nice. Yeah, you're welcome anytime. Just let me know when you're available. We'll make it happen.
Will do. Thanks again for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again, and hope everyone who's listening has a great day, and be sure and check out JV's work. We'll talk to everyone very soon.
Thank you.